that bringing literary theory to bear on text is not a matter of ticking boxes. Here is Lawrence Buell, who has 3 definitions of eco-criticism, and we can see them at work in this novel, right? Okay, tick the boxes, so what? The original contribution to knowledge is to say what these 3 definitions of eco-criticism miss is this gap, which I'm going to explore. And hey presto, he ignores the role of gender, doesn't he? Yes, I'm quoting a paper here that actually has done this, of Mariam's research. So actually identifying a gap and saying, okay, I'm going to employ a methodology of ecofeminism perhaps now to look at this novel as a result of this. Okay? Let me know when you want to stick. Are you ready for a stick?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. So, as I've just said, each chapter now explores a sub-question ending with the need for the next question, i.e. the next chapter.
I want you please to elaborate more on the idea of methodology, because our students find it sometimes very difficult to know what's the meaning of methodology, how to approach the thesis or the paper with a certain method. They don't understand this point well. Can you elaborate more on this point?
Yes, okay. I suppose what you need is a repertoire of methodologies of literary criticism, don't you? And I think they would come from each literary theory. So I'm going to apply a deconstructionist methodology, is what I did in my introduction to eco-criticism. So I'm deconstructing representations of nature. And I'm deconstructing the meaning of the word rain, for example, in this poem by Philip Larkin, and I'm using deconstructionist methodology. I might have been focusing on semiology, I might have been looking at signs, I might have been looking at images, and I might have employed a methodology that derives from looking solely at imagery and signs, you know. So it's a matter of thinking, what is the method that this literary theory requires for me to bring to the text, really? And so it's really using your frames of literary theory to approach the text with this methodology that derives from it. Okay? Okay.
May I ask a question?
Yep.
Can we say here that the word methodology is synonymous with theoretical framework? Can we say that?
Yes, I mean, the methodology is derived from the theoretical frameworks. It's the practice. It's putting that theoretical framework into... That's right.
Of the
exactly so.
Of the text.
Exactly so, yes. Okay. Oh, well, let's get the stick in there. I wouldn't trouble too much about the difference between theoretical frames and methodology, you know. I mean, they're very closely aligned. And it's just that being explicit about knowing what your methodology is shows your confidence. Yeah? Hi. Hi. Yes, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think somewhere in the thesis, you do need to be explicit about your methodology and how it's derived from the theoretical frames that you've chosen to use. Remember, I don't use the word apply. I don't say apply the theory to this text. I say, what questions does the theory bring to a reading of this text? Yeah, I'm not ticking boxes. Here's the theory. The theory says this, 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 and this, and this. Okay, and they're all present in this text. Tick the box. Not they're all present in this text, but what questions do these bring to a reading of this text? And questioning, questioning, questioning. And all the time I'm evaluating strengths and weaknesses, strengths and weaknesses. Even of authors you admire, look for the weaknesses, because they're going to be original new contributions to knowledge. Yeah? All of the other theses are going to be about the strengths. And they're the weak theses. But the strong thesis is going to also engage with the limitations, perhaps. You can say perhaps. You know, you don't have to say this is a very bad weakness, you know, in this novel. You just have to say perhaps the author has neglected to consider. Right? And that's a new contribution to knowledge, if the author has neglected to consider. Are we up and running? Oh great, we are. Marvellous. Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who were at the back and didn't see, these are the three options that my, and let me get out of the way here, that my student is considering for her research question, and that was her original exploration of the field in order to discover which bit of it she wanted to focus the thesis on. Yeah, we've done all that, haven't we? Right, I'll just show you that so it summarises what I've been saying, and particularly for people who've had to come in late. This is what we've been saying. Okay, so at the centre of this is representations of nature in Gothic literature. Up in the very top, at the very top, the third line down is ecophobia mode, and that became the research question. As a result of all of this, and lots of this stuff fell away. She thought she was going to go down the road of folklore and images of folklore in Gothic literature, until I introduced her to the idea of ecophobia, which she thought really applied to Algernon Blackwood, who is the Gothic author that she focused on, the first academic to write on Algernon Blackwood. So she found an author that had been neglected, was known as a Gothic writer, and spread over quite an era, but no academic studies of Algernon Blackwood. Now I find that people are writing papers on Algernon Blackwood, and so I'm hurrying her up to get her book done so she claims the field before these other postgrads at conferences I've heard produce papers on Algernon Blackwood. So she's found a neglected author. Great for new contributions to knowledge, and it helps if they're alive as opposed to dead. It helps if they're alive, because I've also been suggesting, remember, that you might go to archives, interviews, correspondence, and a living author is a source of you producing a new contribution to knowledge in having done an interview, in having had correspondence you can quote, which is new material with a living author. Okay. Right. And as I've said, the conclusion summarises your findings, it identifies your new contributions to knowledge, it finds those sentences where you think you have made new insights, and you have to not be shy about claiming the new insights that this thesis has made, because the external examiner needs it pointing out to them. Yeah? Contains nothing new to the thesis, remember, in the conclusion. Okay. Oh, and you can, of course, in the conclusion, identify further questions to be researched. I think this shows an intelligent researcher who is aware that this thesis has not had the scope to cover these questions, but further research is needed in exploring these questions, which you will, of course, do in the book that is published from the thesis, eventually, we hope, or in further papers. Okay. write the introduction last. I've said that. Oh, this is very important. Decide a referencing system from the beginning and accumulate your bibliography as you go along, right from day one. Always note full references for everything you read. It is an absolute nightmare trying to go back and find that sentence in that paper you read that you found on the net and you've forgotten where you found it. Please always note absolutely full references for everything you read, even if you don't think you're going to need it. Because I know things stay in my head and I think, oh, I didn't think I was going to need that, but my goodness, that stayed in my head. Where did I find it? Nightmare! Order the books again. Search through the books. Nightmare. So, deciding a referencing system, and again, take your supervisor's advice for what is currently used in your institution. Decide on a referencing system. I'm talking about the Harvard system or all these different, but be consistent. In the UK, we don't require a specific referencing system, but we do require a consistency in using one. And use it from the beginning in your note making. I want to make a distinction between the notebook, the annotated journal, and the reading log. The notebook is what I have, of course, always with me in my bag here as things occur in conversations and in recommendations or reading. Of course, you'll have this on your phone, won't you now? You know. But my notebook is small, it's in my pocket, it's small enough for me to carry around all the time. For waking up early in the morning and writing things down, for writing down recommendations that Dr. Magda gives me for things I should be reading. They're down in here, okay. But I keep a journal for the thesis, which is annotated, which has, when I was doing my thesis, I took newspaper cuttings, I stuck them in the journal, I then asked questions of them in the margin. I annotated them, not for posterity, but for practical use, for intellectual inquiry, for forcing myself to ask questions of the material I was collecting. Not collecting for my grandchildren to inherit and for me to sell to an archive in America down the line when they come knocking at the door, when I'm really famous. Never going to happen, is it? It's a practical tool for intellectual inquiry, annotating, asking questions of the material that interests you, that you want to collect in the process of making the thesis. And a reading log is, of course, the notes that you make from your reading, yeah, and the annotations that you make in books. I'm afraid I always pencil annotations in whatever I'm reading, however beautiful a book it is, however precious a book it is to me, because I want to find these things again, yeah, and I want to ask questions of them. So a reading log is slightly different, and both of those things are bigger than the notebook itself, yeah? Okay. In the thesis, you should avoid long footnotes. If you need to write a long footnote, it obviously should be part of the text. Okay? Footnotes should just be really one sentence if you've got something to add, as it were, in brackets. But if you find yourself needing to write a long footnote, it obviously needs to be incorporated into the text. We're getting there. The inquiry is about depth, it's not about scope, and it certainly isn't about coverage. Some American theses are simply covering the field. describing the field. Very poor quality. You're about depth. You're about asking questions. You're about digging deep and pursuing depth of thought. Questions following questions that need to be answered by further questions. Depth of thought produces new contribution to knowledge, not scope. You might inquire about the date of fixing the title of the thesis, because you might want to adjust the title at the last minute. When you've gone some way into the inquiry, you might realise that you need a slightly different title. You need to check your regulations. Is your title fixed when you register the thesis? Or is there a date by which it becomes fixed and you have to stick with it? And this might enable you to narrow the scope in order to get depth. You might want to narrow what you started out over ambitiously thinking you could inquire into. Problematizing your material. This is my thing about looking at strengths and weaknesses. Yeah? The text is not teaching simple lessons. The text is raising questions for readers. What are the questions? Problematize the text. Ask difficult questions of it. Does it ignore this at the expense of achieving this? Yeah? And this is not about making new readings of a text. It's about finding new insights into the text. So it's not about just making a reading that is an interpretation that articulates what you think this author is trying to communicate. It is asking questions about what that author is trying to communicate. Yeah? And evaluating it. And considering the extent to which it achieves what the author's trying to communicate and the extent to which it doesn't achieve it. Question your responses to your material. Ask questions of your responses to the material. Consider opposite positions. This is a very good way of getting deep, is to consider opposite positions. Some readers might say it's saying this. On the other hand, some readers might say it's saying this. Consider opposite positions and have a position of your own at the end of it. So we've been talking about Ted Hughes writes in prose in favour of hunting animals as a way of preserving them. It's the hunters who preserve the deer on Exmoor, he argues. The poetry of Ted Hughes says the opposite. It's critical. It empathises with the hunted animals and empathises with their pain and suffering. So in his prose he's in favour of hunting. In his poetry he appears to be against hunting. What is one to say about that? You have to have a position of your own as a reader. You have to make a judgment of your own as a reader. And this will produce new contributions to knowledge, new insights. And I was saying that one recent book on Ted Hughes says Ted Hughes is contradictory. Well, yes, he is. But where does that leave us? What are we to make of that contradiction? And this produces new contributions, new insights. Yeah? Not allowing yourself simply to say, this author holds a contradictory position, but taking a position on it yourself, evaluating it. On balance, you know, he's got it right in the prose and wrong in the poetry. Or on balance, I would say, for the following reasons, that he's got it right in the poetry, but he's doing something else in the prose that contradicts it. Problematizing your material is quite difficult, especially if you're enthusiastic about the material that you're reading, you know. Especially if you think that the material teaches some very important lessons. You must not treat the material as black and white. Yeah? You must problematize the material. And I have never regretted my PhD supervisor asking me to write clearly and accessibly, to define my terms at every point. Yeah. The result of that was that I was able to publish my thesis without changing a word except the title. So Green Voices actually was my PhD thesis, which was about notions of nature in contemporary poetry, 1940 to 1995. Define your use of jargon, not the use of jargon, but your use of jargon. Yeah? For example, so define the way in which you're using this term, which might be slightly different from the way in which the originator of this term used it. Actually, the person who invented the term ecophobia actually used it in a very critical way of people who denied nature. Ecophobia was people who denied the essentialness of contact with nature. That's how Simon Estock used the term ecophobia when he invented it. But my PhD student used it in a more broad way to examine people's anxieties about the forces of nature, the destructiveness of tides, the destructiveness of storms, and so on. So she had her own way of using the same term and defined her use of it in the jargon. Your outcomes may offer revisions of theory or of methodology, or may offer a completely new concept, term, or category. Now, I've said that new contributions to knowledge may only be small adjustments to what other people have said so far. Yeah? So it doesn't have to be a completely new theory. Yeah? You might be making small reservations about what people have said so far. Offering, and it might be about methodology. Your new contribution to knowledge might be about methodology. It might be about discovering a new way of approaching texts and in a methodology. And that might be your new contribution to knowledge. Okay? I was lucky in constructing the new term post-pastoral in my PhD thesis, which I felt was needed because pastoral was such a negative term, and I needed a new term that would be positive about people writing in the pastoral tradition in a more complex way than had been assumed by pastoral, which had become a pejorative, critical term in the UK. So I was lucky in being able to invent a new term. I did examine a thesis that invented a new term and assumed it was evident from the use of the term through the thesis what that term meant, and indeed it was. But he didn't define the term at the beginning of the thesis and nearly failed for that reason, and also having a bibliography which was not standardized, was all over the place. A PhD represents a standard of scholarship, so it's got to have reached a standard of scholarly referencing. Yep, I've already made that point, haven't I? Okay. Oh, critique your results. What you think of the new contributions of knowledge, be critical of them. Yeah? To what extent are they really new? What could be provisional about your discoveries, dependent on you reading further in this genre, or this author's work, or whatever. So it's quite legitimate to be provisional about your discoveries, and it's important to be self-critical, as well. getting near the end here. How much time have I got? 5 minutes? 5? Okay. And I've already said what needs further testing, what needs further examination, what new questions need to be explored for the next thesis, which becomes the next book. Yeah? I find the way I work is that I work very slowly, revising my approach. The approach that I've adopted in this last paper, I now want to apply in this next paper to the same material, but asking slightly different questions, you know. And that happens to me all the time. So I appear to be actually going over the same ground, but what I'm trying to do is just explore the next corner of that ground, round the corner, yeah? So I've looked at, as you'll see in the last lecture here, the stages of the greening of Ted Hughes. Well, during those stages, 6 stages of his greening, what was happening in British culture and British poetry and British nature writing might reflect those changes in his personal approach. So I did a paper which is coming out, it's on my website now I think, about changes in regarding the British countryside 1960 to 1980 when the countryside turned into the environment. Okay, so Ted Hughes ended up regarding the countryside as the environment in his last stages of his greening, his personal greening. So now I've asked the question, how does that reflect Ted Hughes' attitude to science? So the last paper I've written is about Ted Hughes and science, and you'll see a little bit of that in what I'll be presenting later on in Ted Hughes. So these are the next questions to be asked, you know, the next corner of this field for the next thesis. Proofreading. You will not be able to proofread your own text. You need to pass it on to at least one other person, one other kind person who will proofread your text for you. And if you have a kind colleague for whom you might do this for each other, it's really important. I used to have an editor who said, I would pass this book to 3 proofreaders and there would still be 1 error in it. And he was very knowledgeable. Yeah, I find it helps. I can't proofread on the screen. I have to proofread on hard copy. It makes me read it differently, makes me notice the mistakes more when I printed it out on hard copy. So try and do it and regard it as really important. It's really important for the scholarly reputation of your PhD that it reaches scholarly standards of proofreading. Yeah? And by the way, if you're writing in English, notice that there are different conventions between the American standard of proof. The American conventions are different from British conventions. I know this as editor of books. I'm editing chapters that are being sent in to me by Americans, and they use double inverted commas instead of single ones, which we use in the UK, but they put the full stop inside the quotation marks at the end of a sentence. In the UK, we always put the full stop outside the quotation marks at the end of a sentence. Yeah, so be alert to this detail, which is crucially important. It shows the care that you've taken as a scholar in producing your thesis, the standard of your proofreading. You might have a role in choosing your external examiners. In the UK, it's quite common for the examiner, for the supervisor, to discuss with the candidate who might be potentially external examiners. You don't want to choose an external examiner with who you've heavily criticised in the thesis as having very severe weaknesses in their approach so far. But choosing an external who's going to be useful as a future reference to you might be borne in mind. That is somebody who is well known in the field and might be a useful reference to you down the line. Somebody who might recommend you for publication. One of my students wanted an external examiner who edited a series of books that she wanted to submit the thesis revised. The thesis always has to be revised as a book proposal, and you have to show how it's revised from the thesis to make a book proposal. But she wanted a series editor because she wanted to contribute a book to the series that they were editing. And an examiner who might offer some further mentoring for the further research might also be borne in mind. Right, I'm coming to very short addenda here now. Oh, yeah.
The word addenda, I like it.
These are afterthoughts. At the University of Leeds, a PhD student makes notes from the supervision meeting with the supervisor, sends those notes to the supervisor for the supervisor's approval or amendment, and they act as a record of the supervision. This, the University of Leeds requires, and those records are referred to should there be any complaint. And a big university like Leeds always has complaints from PhD students who haven't passed as well as they had hoped or whatever. So this is a record of the supervision which can be referred to if the student has any disagreements with the supervisor down the line. It's always very good discipline, I think, this reminder. And remember that as a postgrad student writing a PhD, you are in a network of people in the field. So postgraduates working in eco-criticism might be connected with each other through ASLI, the Association for Studies in Literature and Environment. And indeed, ASLI organises postgraduate conferences for postgraduates in the field to come together and present papers at which senior scholars are banned from presenting papers. This is entirely for postgraduates. And the UK ASLI group is holding a postgraduate conference on the Isle of Orkney in September. We do this every other year. There's a postgraduate conference, and in the alternating years there's a senior ASLI conference at which postgraduates are welcome to offer abstracts, of course, actually. And of course there are specialisms like people working in the Ted Hughes field, studying the poetry of Ted Hughes, will be linked with each other via the Ted Hughes Society. And at the Ted Hughes Society we have a postgraduate officer and SCAE who keeps postgraduates around the world in touch with each other. Yeah? Yeah, network of postgrad conferences. Oh, right, yes. Well, this is a summary of a final tutorial by a creative writing student who offered me this as a record. This really doesn't apply because this is very much concerned with the research commentary that accompanied a novel as a PhD. So this is a creative writing research project. Okay, there we are. Come to the end. I hope that's all useful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Terry Gifford. We are now having our high strengths in the university coming to